This video is sponsored by Lost in Cult. The free time of my teen years was mostly spent on the Source engine. This ranged from chaotic multiplayer experiences like Left 4 Dead 2 to the life-changing Portal games that I savoured playing on my own. Valve's Source engine titles all share a certain visual DNA in my memory, some being more subtle than others. I always wanted to dive into analysing the style of these titles that left such a strong impression on my younger self, unpacking the influences and visual formula that I and many others find so captivating. Deciding which game I should start with was an easy choice, because to me, Half-Life 2 is one of the best looking games ever and has stood the test of time over 20 years later. Although the visual identity of virtual worlds isn't always affected by the decades after its release, there have been too many instances where the quality and preservation of physical games has unfortunately been neglected. This is why Lost in Cult's new preservation and design-led games label Editions is so important, instead focusing on celebrating video games as art and giving them the care that they deserve through prestigious high-end physical media. Every release is tested to ensure they work fully without internet connectivity or the need for patches, and they have all the current most up-to-date versions of the game fully tested before going to print. They first launched with Thank Goodness You're Here, The Excavation of Hobbs Barrow, and a personal favourite of mine, Immortality, as well as their most recent release for Haunty, a beautiful visually unique action-adventure game available for both PS5 and Switch. For their commitment to preservation, Lost in Cult have standard versions for these titles at mass retail, but the limited editions are packaged within slipcases featuring original artwork, and also house a gorgeous inner slipcase containing art cards, posters, a booklet with an essay piece and developer interview, and an individually numbered authenticity card. These editions are available in limited quantities, so grab them fast if you're interested in a premium physical copy for any title in this special curation. There is one Switch and one PS5 release a month, with Switch 2 titles also coming soon. Tri-monthly bundles are an option too, so you can collect the entire artistic lineup for your preferred platform, which comes with a slight discount and saves on multiple shipping, as well as helping you never miss a release. Lost in Cult always produce must-have gaming treasures and have consistently supported the channel, so if this looks up your alley, please show your support for Editions and help support me in turn by using code EuroThugGames to get 5% off any Editions game or anything on lostincult.co.uk right now for a limited time. I'll also have the link in the description. There's a lot of different levels and environments that make up protagonist Gordon Freeman's journey through Half-Life 2 and its episodes, but I want to focus on those that stick out in my memory the most, starting with those unforgettable opening sections welcoming us into City 17. The first Half-Life took us through the high-tech Black Mesa research facility and the alien landscapes of Xen. And according to the article The Final Hours of Half-Life 2 by Jeff Keighley, the team first considered designing a game where Gordon would teleport to various planets around the galaxy and combat the Xen aliens from the first game. However, this presented some issues with continuity between levels. Then Viktor Antonov, Valve's Bulgarian-born art director, suggested that the team think of setting the game in the suburban and outlying areas around an Eastern European-style city. This shifted the arguably typical sci-fi action movie setting to somewhere a lot more residential and familiar to most people. City 17 is a place that wears its visible struggle under the totalitarian control of the Combine on its sleeve, whose presence and watch is overtly shown through the technological invasion of the interdimensional empire. Monitors and speakers force the face and words of the Combine's human representative Dr. Wallace Breen into your brain. Inhuman-looking control consoles feed on existing power cables like a parasite, and intimidatingly angular barricades pierce through the European architecture and streets. Though it's the Citadel that serves as the most overbearing reminder of the Combine's cold grip on humanity. Its cables reach across the rooftops below, as its hidden peak stretches into the clouds. Initial concept arts, though far darker and grittier, also emphasize the Big Brother-esque portrayal of Dr. Breen. I really like some of the more cyber-gothic styles shown in some of the concept arts, but City 17 has a sense of realism as it's not fully rebuilt, but rather infected with invasive technology that doesn't belong. It's a city that's in conflict not just with its inhabitants and their oppressors, but with its architecture too. In a GDC talk presented by Victor, he said that they tried to have some of the monsters not in halls, but outside on beautiful autumn days. He cited the Stanley Kubrick film Barry Lyndon, set against gorgeous landscapes, but with cruel, tiny people. City 17 looks almost normal. Well, maybe a bit empty population-wise, but it makes life there seem even more depressing. Architecturally, it's not too far off from the world before the Combine, which those now held prisoners still remember, mourn, and even fight for. In order to weave together the clashing worlds authentically, the team built the human foundations of City 17 before then adding the contrasting Combine mark on top of it. But even just the underlying structures, as I learned through the making of and art book called Half-Life 2 Raising the Bar, were given so much attention and detail that it's no wonder this virtual space feels so tangible. The process was based on the actual evolution of some European cities. The art team began with 19th century architecture, and on this foundation added building styles from the 1930s, 40s, and eventually the 70s. It provided multiple layers of history that precedes the Combine's arrival and their own forceful addition to the story of this city. This theme was a reason why Eastern Europe specifically was chosen as the reference for this location, and as explained by Viktor Antonov, they liked that setting as it represents the collision of the old and the new in a way that is difficult to capture in the United States. You go over there and you have this collision between all of these things. The new architecture, the old architecture, the fall of communism. There's a sense of this strongly grounded historical place. We left out the Gothic themes associated with Prague and vampires and looked into a different aspect of the region. It was a key point during development to always research before building, which led to numerous field trips and internet searches with the goal of collecting reference images to base their concepts off of. According to the art book, they had a reference folder that held over 50,000 images that were gathered over the 6-year development period. It also notes that there was a lot of consideration for even the smallest intricacies, like studying photographs of a rooftop in Sofia, Bulgaria to recreate them in-game as faithfully as possible, materials, shaders, and all. In the words of Victor, you can have a whole story in one texture. Other locations used for reference included Russia and Romania, for instance, and the Austerlitz station in Paris influenced the final version of the opening train station we see. Also, in the Half-Life 2 20th anniversary documentary, Victor states that there's an identical station in Budapest too. The ordinariness of the streets and buildings we traverse in City 17 make the flow between areas even more natural. It's not just about the main plaza or special landmarks, it's even more so about the space in between. It balances the spectacular with the familiar. When walking around a real city you're visiting, it's these more hidden areas and secret spaces that you find yourself in that persist in your memory long after you've left. You witness all kinds of unique characteristics that make up the distinct style of the place you're in, and maybe even capture moments of the lives of locals as you pass by. Half-Life 2 subtly showcases the experience of its inhabitants, whether or not you choose to pay attention. There'll be doors that are open just enough for you to see a Combine soldier implied to be mistreating a civilian, and you're met with threats of violence if you stand too close. In his GDC presentation, Victor said that they wanted to inject inexplicit, disturbing elements like this, hailing a key scene in Rosemary's Baby that is blocked from view by a doorway as a prime example. Without these sort of strategic images, a game can simply become decorative art. It's a world that you can feel almost breathing through its visual storytelling, with its environment and organic moments communicating the narrative in a way that cities and games rarely achieve. Every conversation you overhear is meaningful, and it's not just random dialogue to simply add the sound of a voice. They tell you parts of the story that you can piece together yourself. Not everything has to be seen, it's enough to be implied. As hostile as most areas in and around City 17 are, there are some that offer some semblance of comforts, like Kleiner's lab. Aside from giving the player a breather from any action or combat that comes before or after, it lets you revel in the numerous details of the patchwork lab while never letting go of its narrative context. The main room sports all kinds of devices with their different models, and mismatched CRTs stacked on top of one another like a technological scrapbook. Messy cables strewn across the floor and walls add further to the haphazard construction. The space clearly was not built to look clean and futuristic. Rather, it's obvious that Dr. Kleiner had to make something practical out of what was available, and that wouldn't be all that much given the circumstances. Regardless of the dangers present outside its walls, there are still personal touches within the lab, with photographs, small decorations, and rugs modestly contributing to a sense of homeliness in spite of it all. There's also a number of things you can interact with, serving a kind of playfulness to the environments that isn't purely reliant on the shenanigans of the mischievous headcrab Lamar.
No, not up there!
There are a couple other resistance settlements we come across which each have their own light-hearted aspects too, and there are also small reminders of humanity's persistence throughout other levels in the form of lambda caches. They're little pockets of support giving you resources, but also a signal that someone on your side has passed through here too, even if their corpse is right there. As a stark contrast to the cozier areas of the game, Half-Life 2 also has its more horror-focused moments, which varies from dark tunnels of zombies to the infamous Ravenholm. Looking through concept art, even for the first Half-Life game, it's obvious that there's a good bit of horror DNA there. There's a creepiness in moving through the unnervingly long corridors of Black Mesa and being confronted with the horrifying result of Xen lifeforms coming into contact with the helpless workers. Yet Half-Life 2 would take a much darker approach, quite literally too, as you have to survive the zombie-filled town of Ravenholm at night. It's once again a residential location, it's just this time its inhabitants are made up of headcrabs and zombies with new, even more menacing variants to boot. This hive of deadly lifeforms come with the fast zombie type, whose ability to jump and run with considerable speed was the last thing Gordon wanted to see after his long day. It's super unnerving hearing rattling pipes indicating one of them is climbing towards you, and even the slower moving creatures can cause a considerable panic when suddenly appearing around a tight corner. Yet in the face of such horrors, the methods of combat here are arguably some of the most fun ones in the game. This is partially thanks to the gravity gun, but also in large part due to Ravenholm's only remaining survivor leaving all kinds of traps you can control. You can squish your opponents underneath cars and coax them through flames or a spinning blade, making the task of defeating the onslaught of enemies a grand opportunity to experiment with the game's physics. There are other visually eerie sections too, like the hospital in Episode 1. But I also remember being considerably stressed out balancing and jumping across thin beams underneath the bridge of Highway 17, which brings me onto the more open outdoor areas of Half-Life 2. These places contrast the more enclosed locations visually and mechanically, usually giving you a vehicle to journey through those long stretches. They're largely quite empty overall, making for a good opportunity for a chase sequence or sometimes just a scenic drive to the next structure along your path. It feels like a breath of fresh air to have all that open space around you, even if it is somewhat isolating at times. And regardless of there being an occasional enemy ambush, I find the long-distance traversal sections to often be quite therapeutic. The experience of Highway 17 is one of the first things that comes to my mind when I think of Half-Life 2, with memories of exploring these abandoned outcroppings of buildings or other details that I could have easily driven past and ignored. It manages to sustain a level of eeriness as well. Everything seems a little too quiet, and you're still witnessing the devastating remains of a world now conquered by the Combine. The confined areas we've been in beforehand feel in some ways like a cage, with the Combine and their architecture boxing you in. And while the open spaces initially feel like freedom, you realise that you are now just in a much bigger cage. The environments are what deviate the most from the original Half-Life, but an aspect that shares many similarities are the enemy types, specifically those from the border world Xen. While certain beasts like hound eyes don't make an appearance, Gordon is reacquainted with the headcrabs, zombies, and barnacles. This time their gross fleshiness is seen in higher fidelity and featuring new variants. Artist Ted Backman said that a lot of times in games, developers play the horror card and try to make something that has big pointy teeth and make it as scary as possible. I have never been satisfied by that. It seems a little too heavy-handed and isn't usually scary. Instead of going for the horror response, I really like to make it more revolting, something that is just disgusting. When you look at a lot of things in nature, like maggots, they are not especially scary, but they are one of the most horrific things that you can think of if you really watch them. It is that sort of response that we are always trying to play up. I always thought that these enemies have an incredibly memorable simplicity, since they're mostly quite basic forms and concepts just made to be off-putting through grotesque biological details, behaviours, and sounds. Speaking of which, the zombies in Half-Life 2 have an audible difference as well, whereby you can hear their victims' cries for help through their pained groans. It brings about a new implication that the human hosts are still somewhat conscious, or perhaps it's just an echo of their last words or thoughts on repeat. Both are equally disturbing regardless. The creatures I've discussed so far all act on their own instinct. They're neither on the side of the Combine or humanity, though all three of these groups share the sole purpose of survival. Half-Life 2 introduces an additional species called antlions, an insect-like critter that mainly resides underground but will ascend to the surface if it detects vibrations of possible prey. As a foe, it might be preferable to avoid touching the ground and planning how to bridge your way across using nearby objects, lest you want to be swarmed by these giant alien bugs. But not too long after their first introduction, the relationship the player has with them changes when you come into the possession of theropods. These can be used to control antlions, so you can deploy an army of them to deal with any Combine soldiers you face, and gleefully watch as they overrun them. This is something I love about Half-Life 2, being able to see how the three main groups all interact with each other and occasionally make use of one another in order to achieve their own goals. Even the Combine have deployed biological Zen weaponry in the form of headcrab shells, which they unleashed upon resistance bases to wipe them out with a zombie infestation. Another friendly species we come into contact with are the Vortigaunts, who have been stranded on Earth after the Black Mesa incident and, much like the humans, have been enslaved by the Combine. This contrasts the relationship we had with them in Half-Life 1, where they were just another enemy for us to mow down with bullets, so seeing one of them in the opening minutes of the game sweeping the floors provided a massive shift in perspective towards them. They are so lovable now with their little quirks and friendly nature, helping out the Resistance and just hanging out. I absolutely adore the elevator scene in Black Mesa East, where you can see them playing chess and cooking up meals in the kitchen. Obviously, the main antagonist of Half-Life 2 is the Combine, and you can distinguish them quite easily from the other fauna that crossed over from Zen. Their army is made up of both human soldiers and synthetics, both of whom leave a strong mark on the style of this game, and differentiates it from the aesthetic of the original. Ted Backman's concept art for these synths especially is hauntingly surreal, and in the 20th anniversary documentary, he said that there was definitely an evolution of how biological versus how synthetic a lot of the creatures in Half-Life 2 were. I was always hoping to get to a space where it was ambiguous, where you couldn't quite tell if this was created, or if it had grown, or if it was natural or synthetic. These biomechanical weapons consist of creatures that were possibly once entirely organic, and were likely species that the Combine had enslaved and converted during previous invasions. Kinda like a forceful evolution, as mentioned by artist Zabi Eng in the Making of book. The synths include enemies like the gunships, hunters, and the striders, the latter of which was created from the idea to have a sort of moving guard tower as an opponent. The way it blends the organic alien design with mechanical shapes and features in some ways makes them look somewhat in pain, like its body has been artificially moulded around rotors and artillery, though that aspect is at its most obvious when it comes to the Stalkers. Unlike synths, Stalkers were once human. They're usually either former Resistance members who have been punished, or simply people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, as stated by Alex. The design for the Stalkers is absolutely terrifying, with amputated limbs replaced by thin peg legs and a hook for a hand, while the rest of their body has had its organs removed, and their skin clings to nothing but bone and metal that shouldn't be there. All of the concept art for them portrays that torturous part of their creation, and it's really distressing to look at. I know the headcrab victims have it rough, but this just feels unnecessarily evil, seeing those weak, destroyed bodies barely balancing on tiny pegs. It's almost as though the Combine aimed to create a maintenance worker with just the bare minimum human aspect required, even if it made it less efficient. I'm convinced its design was conceived by them to also serve as a warning to anyone who is thinking of joining the Resistance, because this seems overtly cruel even for an alien empire trying to conquer different worlds. Stalkers are disfigured physically and mentally, mindlessly tending to the maintenance tasks programmed into them by the Combine. For the most part, they leave Gordon alone, and it's not mandatory to fight them, but even just the sight of these once human creatures evokes pity. While we don't know for certain what the form of the original Combine leaders looks like, we see beings that seem to be at the top of the hierarchy on Earth. They're referred to as the Advisors, and according to Ted Backman, they wanted to think about what an organism would look like if it began to depend on the technology that was originally created to improve its quality of life. Over the course of its evolution, it became grub-like, with limbs no longer able to support its own weight, eyes too feeble to see without aid, a body now incapable of movement, fully dependent on the technology that it created. It was, however, incredibly evolved in its ability to reason, invent, and dominate the minds and cultures of other beings. This design was also in part inspired by the writings of Frank Herbert. Their design, in contrast to Stalker's, definitely appears to show augmentations rather than regressions to the original host's capabilities. The lumpy pale maggot body is wrapped in a fitted cloth pouch, with mechanical arm attachments to allow for dexterity they wouldn't otherwise have. They're shown with some kind of mask to possibly aid breathing, and also have a little robotic eyepiece that lets them see. Without all of that, they're basically just a fat squishy lima bean with psychic abilities, and I wonder if they enslave other, more capable species and mold them into their own tools to preemptively eliminate a possible future threat to their empire. Maybe taking over other beings who are evolving to be too powerful, and then setting them on a different evolutionary path for a purpose that suits them instead. Though that's assuming the advisors are near the top of the chain of command for the Combine as a whole, or in some way benefit from the Empire. I will say though that I do find the advisors a little creepy when they have their proboscis out, and despite their size, their intimidating psychic powers do make them a force to be reckoned with. The Combine also have a human military force that make up the Combine Overwatch on Earth. The Metro Cops we first come across are human volunteers, whereas the Combine soldiers are cybernetically and psychologically modified to be better at combat and remain obedient. All types wear gas masks, giving them a menacing air even without the body horror we've seen in some synths. Their outfits aside, the Combine Overwatch make use of a variety of gadgets and weapons to hunt Gordon down. From the hovering scanners that float through the streets and relay information, hopper mines hidden in plain sight, to the more aggressive manhacks that aim to chop you up to bits. The Combine technology in general uses dark metallic colours with striking lights, though it's not until you visit the interior of the Citadel where you can see just how structurally ominous it can be. Throughout the pod sequence giving a tour of some of the Hive, its corridors stretch upwards endlessly, with its numerous sections dedicated to manufacturing its synthetic army. All you can hear is the structure creaking and the whirring of its technology at work as you navigate this place alone. Its architecture is often asymmetric but razor sharp, and its lengthy walkways are often made of glass, which showcases the steep drop below. It's as unfriendly as it can possibly be, just like its owners. Fortunately, there are a lot of friendly faces in Half-Life 2, a lot of which have returned from the first game to add a sense of continuity. Dr. Kleiner, of course, being a representative for all those scientist models in Black Mesa, but we also specifically get to reunite with other survivors from the incidents like Eli and Barney once again. There's an authenticity to the human characters that comes from how the development team recruited the real-life face models for them. They'd cast random people they found in front of supermarkets, or waiters in restaurants. Even Dr. Kleiner turned out to be an accountant that worked in a firm in the same building as Valve's office. There was also an ad they put out in the Seattle Times too, where people could send in photos, and all these methods resulted in a very diverse and realistic range of looks to make each character feel like their own person. In some cases, like with Gordon Freeman, multiple faces would be morphed together to achieve the right image they were going for. The fact that these were essentially all ordinary people and looked the part made it not only more realistic, but also works when it comes to connecting to the characters, something that's sold even better by the performances. The clothing the Resistance wear is entirely practical and made from whatever they could get their hands on, though the main characters you come across have details that make them more distinguishable, but overall stay relatively simple with maybe one or two details to add more personality, like how Alex notably has a hole in her jacket duct taped together. The designs of the repatriated citizens of City 17, however, are the complete opposite. Their individuality has been stripped away under the Combine's oppression, and they are visibly downtrodden in this prison-like atmosphere. Much like the blend of the ordinary and the spectacular that pertains to the environments, there's one character who I think best exemplifies that theme, that being the briefcase-wielding G-Man. Despite just resembling a guy in a suit, there's a very unsettling uncanniness to him. Some of it comes from adapting the very stylized features of his Half-Life 1 model, but there's also the addition of his almost glowing green eyes that are accentuated by what kinda looks like a very subtle smoky eye. His behaviour is cryptic too, as he often appears and disappears like a paranormal entity you may just happen to catch the sight of. The voice actor for G-Man, Mike Shapiro, described his perspective of the character as being in multiple places at once, simultaneously experiencing several moments in time. This is why there are weird breaks in his speech, and an emphasis on certain words or sounds that come across very unnaturally, as well as inexplicable changes in his tone or expressions. He can alternate between a face of concern and a scheming smirk, which leaves his sincerity just as unclear as his humanity. There's always something off about him, and he has such a mysterious and intimidating demeanor that, in my opinion, makes him one of the greatest video game characters of all time. Half-Life 2 incorporates a lot of iconic imagery and designs from its predecessor, the crowbar, the HEV suit, and even its charges, translating them into this new world with changes both delicate and extreme. It takes enough from its original title to keep things feeling like Half-Life, but also does so much more to add its own unique style to the series. It keeps the unintrusive HUD style of the first game, with a very clean, simple font and menu that complements the more cinematic experience as opposed to other games at the time. I also have to mention the renders by Zabi Eng, like the cover art. It has a limited color palette with basic but captivating composition, usually featuring the orange highlights of the HEV suits that, as a color, feels synonymous with Half-Life at this point. These renders perfectly relay the philosophy of the game's visual style, that everything is done with so much intention. Obviously, I didn't cover every single aspect of what makes the art direction of Half-Life 2 so brilliant, but hopefully some of you watching can relate to how this game made me feel and why, or maybe even just learned a little bit about the making of the post-Soviet inspired City 17. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see my future work, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much to my patrons for supporting the channel, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.